welcome to the Shalom Learning Center 10-minute Lectorium. And we're focusing on the subject of Jewish history, which is very important in our understanding of the New Testament and beyond. And so this is lecture number 6, and we continue discussing the Persian period and Jewish diaspora in the Persian period. We talked about the book of Esther and the possibility that the son of the king of Ahasuerus, King Artaxerxes, as it's recorded in Hebrew, Artaxerxes in Greek, he could have Esther as his mother, and so could be halachically Jewish. Of course, that's not applicable to that period. Today's the halacha determines anybody who has Jewish mother to be Jewish. Of course, it wasn't the case 2,500 years ago, but so don't take this serious. As well as I mentioned, the book of Esther is a satire, and so this laughter and ridicule of Mordecai, who was looking for opportunities at the court of the pagan king, it turned out to be fairly dangerous for Jewish people, but they were miraculously spared because for whatever reason, only definitely because of God's intervention, King Xerxes, the Ahasuerus, stretched his scepter to his queen Esther, who was able to plead for his people. And this is how the holiday known as Purim was established. And it was established to remember these events. And in Jewish tradition, Purim is always done with lots of theatrical performances. Some of it are very, very comical or satirical, because according to rabbinic tradition, it's important to laugh on the during the holiday of Purim. But let's go beyond that, and let's go into the next Persian king, Artaxerxes, who in the 7th year of his reign, which is 457 BCE, gives permission to Ezra, who is the priest and the scribe, to lead another group of returnees from Babylonian exile, which is basically almost 70 years after the famous Edict of Cyrus, back to Jerusalem. Now the temple is functioning, but what Ezra has in mind is to rebuild the walls of the city, which causes an uproar among the Samaritan neighbors, who tried to stop the process in the same way as they were trying to stop Zerubbabel and Jewish people 70 years before from rebuilding the temple. And by the way, this is the main reason why Jews and Samaritans did not like each other. Samaritans did not want Jews to come back to their land. And Samaritans, they were kind of an interesting group of people. They believed that they were the true Jews. And this is why it is interesting in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, Jesus speaks to a Samaritan woman and being direct with her, saying, "You do not know whom you worship, but we know, because salvation is of the Jews." So it's important to understand the background of the relationship between Jews and Samaritans when we study the Gospel of John, and the background is in the time of Ezra, in the time of Zerubbabel, although the events which are recorded in the history of return from the exile are written in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's one book, which in English Bible it's two books, book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. And this is very important because Ezra, though he wasn't the best manager of the rebuilding of the city, it took Nehemiah, who came 13 years later. Nehemiah was a cupbearer for the king of Artaxerxes, again, Jewish cupbearer. This is the most important security position at the court, because whatever king drinks has to pass through the cupbearer. That's why I do believe that Artaxerxes had Jewish mother who hired him a trustworthy Jewish cupbearer, and then when Nehemiah was sad one day after having learned that Jerusalem situation is not very good and rebuilding is very slow, and so in the book of Nehemiah chapter 1 it mentions the queen. The king was sitting and the queen, and in the context of that time it was definitely queen mother, not the queen wife. And so it's the queen mother who nudges Artaxerxes to give permission to Nehemiah to go back. And so he does with a third group of returnees. And under the leadership of Nehemiah, Jerusalem is finally rebuilt. And so Judea becomes a protectorate within the Medo-Persian Empire. And so we have the return from the exile, the three stages as described in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. The first stage is 535 BCE with Zerubbabel, the second stage with Ezra, 457, and the third stage with Nehemiah, 444 BCE. And by the late 5th century, we finally have Jerusalem rebuilt and Judean cities restored, and that's because of the leadership of Nehemiah, who is basically, that period is basically ends what is known as the Old Testament period, with the last prophet Malachi, who prophesies about the coming of Elijah the prophet, and from that, about 420 BC, we don't have any more biblical books composed. But going back to Ezra, Ezra was not the best manager, but he was a very important figure in the biblical history, because he was at the same time a scribe and a priest. And that's very important in understanding of how Judaism was formed. And we'll talk about this in our next lecture.